Ethan Ward was not the kind of man people noticed. He was average height, average build, with short brown hair that never quite sat flat on one side no matter how many times he pushed it down. He carried a worn gray tool bag over one shoulder and a thermos of cold coffee in his other hand because he had forgotten to drink it that morning. He wore a faded company jacket with the words Ward Thermal Solutions printed on the back in letters that had mostly peeled off, so now it just said War Ermolutions, which his co-workers back on Earth found very funny. Ethan did not find it funny or unfunny. He just wore the jacket. He stepped off the transport shuttle and onto docking bay 7 of the Soreth Imperial Station, and the first thing he felt was the cold. Not regular cold like an open window on a winter morning. This was the kind of cold that got into your bones and stayed there, the kind that made you feel like the building itself had decided it did not want you inside it. The second thing he noticed was that everything was enormous. The ceilings were at least 40 feet high. The doorways were wide enough to drive 2 trucks through side by side. The corridors stretched on so long that the far ends disappeared into a kind of gray haze. Everything was built from dark stone that looked older than most human cities, carved with patterns that must have meant something important but Ethan could not read. Fires burned in iron brackets along the walls, but they did not do much against the cold. They just flickered and threw long shadows across the floor. The third thing he noticed was that nobody looked at him. There were dragons moving through the docking bay, large ones, each one easily 3 times his height, with scales and dark colors, deep green, charcoal gray, dull red. They moved with the slow, deliberate confidence of creatures who had never once in their lives needed to hurry. A few of them wore uniforms with imperial markings. Most were carrying things: data tablets, equipment cases, cargo. None of them looked at Ethan. Not even for a second. He was used to that. Humans were not common on Dragon Empire stations. They were not unwelcome exactly, but they were not exactly welcomed either. The dragons considered themselves an ancient and superior civilization, which to be fair they mostly were. Their technology was thousands of years old. Their empire covered dozens of star systems. Their emperor had been ruling longer than most human nations had existed. Humans were newer, smaller, less impressive. But humans were good at fixing things. Practical things. Mechanical things. Things that broke down and needed someone patient and careful to get on their knees and figure out what had gone wrong. That was why companies like Ethan's got contracted out to stations like this one. Not for glory. Not for diplomacy. Just for the quiet, unglamorous work that kept ancient places from falling apart. Ethan found the station manager's office after about 10 minutes of walking in what he hoped was the right direction. The station manager was a dragon with dark green scales and a long scar across one side of his jaw. He looked at Ethan the way someone looks at a package they ordered and forgot about. He handed over a data tablet with the work orders loaded on it and pointed toward a side corridor without saying anything useful. Ethan took the tablet and looked through the list. Most of it was standard. Heating coils in the worker quarters. A broken ventilation unit in the cargo storage level. A pressure fault in the lower deck pipes. Normal work. The kind of thing he had done hundreds of times on dozens of different stations and ships and facilities across 3 different star systems. He could do most of it with his eyes closed. Then he got to the last item on the list. Imperial Wing, Chamber 7. Heating unit failure. Duration of fault, 8 months. Ethan read that number again. 8 months. The heating in a room had been broken for 8 months and nobody had fixed it. He looked up from the tablet. A young dragon worker was passing nearby, carrying a stack of metal crates. Ethan stepped into his path politely. "Excuse me," Ethan said. "The Imperial Wing. Chamber 7. The work order says the heating has been out for 8 months. Is that right?" The young dragon stopped. He looked at Ethan, then at the tablet, then back at Ethan. Something moved across his face that was not quite fear but was close to it. "Yes," the young dragon said quietly. "Why hasn't it been fixed?" Ethan asked. The young dragon set his crates down and leaned slightly closer, lowering his voice even though nobody nearby was paying attention to either of them. He explained quickly and in a low tone that Chamber 7 was not just any room in the Imperial Wing. It was the Emperor's private chamber. Emperor Soreth himself. And Emperor Soreth had not been receiving visitors. Not healers, not court officials, not family. Nobody. The chamber doors had been closed for months. The few staff members who had approached to attempt repairs had been turned away by the guard. One engineer had apparently made it as far as the door before being told by the guard captain in very clear terms that he should leave immediately and not return. So nobody went. The heating stayed broken. And apparently nobody in the entire Imperial administration had decided that a different approach was worth trying, so the work order had just sat there, untouched, getting older, until it ended up at the bottom of a list handed to a human technician from a small company whose jacket said War Ermolutions. Ethan listened to all of this. He nodded slowly. Okay, he said. Thanks. He picked up his tool bag and started walking in the direction the station manager had pointed. The young dragon stared after him. The Imperial Wing is that way, he called, pointing in a completely different direction. Right, Ethan said and turned around. The walk to the Imperial Wing took about 15 minutes. The corridors grew quieter the further in he went. The stone walls became smoother, darker, better carved. The fire brackets became more ornate. The floor changed from rough stone to something polished and dark that reflected the firelight. There were fewer dragons moving around, and the ones he did pass wore Imperial Guard uniforms and watched him with sharp, careful eyes but said nothing to stop him. He had a valid work order on an official station tablet. He was wearing his company jacket. He was carrying a tool bag. He looked exactly like what he was, a technician going to fix something. Nobody stopped him. He found Chamber 7 at the end of a long corridor that felt colder than everywhere else on the station. The air here was different. Still and heavy, like the air inside an old building that had been shut up for too long. His breath came out in small white clouds. The frost was visible on the stone walls, thin and white, catching the light from the fire brackets. The iron door at the end of the corridor was enormous and dark, with Imperial markings carved deep into the metal. 2 guards stood on either side of it. They looked at Ethan when he approached. He held up the data tablet. Work order, he said simply. Heating repair. Chamber 7. The 2 guards looked at each other. Then at the tablet. Then at Ethan again. He waited. One of the guards reached out and checked the tablet. The work order was there, official, stamped, legitimate. The guard handed it back. There was a long pause. Then, without a word, one of the guards stepped aside. Ethan pushed open the heavy door. The cold that hit him from inside the chamber was immediate and sharp, far colder than the corridor, colder than anywhere else on the station. The room was vast, bigger than most buildings Ethan had worked in, the ceiling lost somewhere far above in shadow. Stone columns rose along the walls. Dim light came from low-burning fire brackets that had almost burned out completely and were producing more smoke than heat. And there, on a great flat platform of dark stone in the center of the room, was Emperor Soreth. He was enormous. Even lying still he was enormous, easily 60 feet from head to tail, covered in scales the color of deep charcoal, each one the size of a dinner plate. His great horned head rested on the stone. His eyes were closed. His breathing was slow and shallow and came with a faint sound like wind moving through a cracked pipe. Ethan stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at him. Then he looked at the heating unit mounted on the far wall, old model, thermal coil system, visibly damaged even from across the room. He walked to it, set his tool bag down and got to work. Ethan had worked on a lot of heating units in his life. He had fixed systems on cold mining stations orbiting frozen moons. He had crawled through the undersides of cargo ships in deep space where the temperature was so low that the metal cracked if you touched it wrong. He had spent an entire week once lying on his back inside a narrow maintenance shaft on a human colony station, fixing a heating fault that 3 other technicians had given up on, eating protein bars and listening to old music through one earphone while he worked. He was comfortable with cold. Cold was just a condition. It did not bother him the way it bothered other people. But this room was something else. The cold in Chamber 7 was not just low temperature. It was the kind of cold that felt intentional, like the room itself had been producing it for so long that it had become part of the stone. The frost on the walls was not thin anymore up close. It was layered, built up over months, white and thick in the corners and along the edges of the floor. The fire brackets on the walls were barely alive, their flames small and pale, doing almost nothing. The heating unit on the far wall had a long crack running across its main casing that Ethan could see clearly even before he opened his bag. 8 months. That crack had probably been there from the beginning. He crouched in front of the unit and started his initial check. He ran his hand along the casing first, feeling for secondary damage. He checked the input valves. He looked at the coil housing through the side inspection panel. The primary coil was cracked through completely, a clean break, probably caused by a pressure fault that had never been caught early enough. Once the primary coil went, the whole unit stopped producing real heat. It would still run. It would still make sound and use power. But it would produce almost nothing. Just enough to look like it was working if nobody checked carefully. 8 months of almost nothing in a room with a sick emperor inside it. Ethan sat back on his heels and thought about that for a moment. Then he opened his bag and got to work. He did not make much noise. He rarely did when he worked. He had a habit of moving carefully and deliberately, setting each tool down gently, not dropping things, not banging casings. Some technicians worked loud, music playing, talking to themselves, clattering around. Ethan worked quiet. It helped him think. He was about 12 minutes into the job, casing panel removed, primary coil disconnected, when he heard it. A sound, low and slow, like two heavy stones grinding together deep underground. He did not immediately look up. He finished the connection he was working on, set the tool down carefully, and then looked over his shoulder. Emperor Sorith had opened one eye. It was golden. Not yellow, not amber, gold, like actual metal, deep and reflective, with a long vertical pupil that had adjusted in the low light and was now pointed directly at Ethan. The eye was enormous, easily the size of Ethan's entire head. It did not blink. Just looked. Ethan looked back. Then he turned back to the heating unit and kept working. Behind him, he heard the slow, heavy sound of Sorith's breathing shift slightly. It was not quite a reaction. It was more like the breathing of someone who had expected something to happen and was mildly surprised that it had not. Ethan imagined that most creatures, upon realizing they were being watched by a 900-year-old dragon emperor, did something. Bowed, ran, made some kind of noise, dropped their tools. Ethan picked up a calibration instrument and checked the secondary coil housing. The secondary coil was intact, which was good news. He could work with that. He pulled the replacement primary coil from his bag. He carried standard sizes for most older thermal systems because older stations always had older units and older units always needed the same basic parts. He checked the size against the housing. It was close. Close enough. He would need to modify the fitting slightly, but that was 10 minutes of work at most. He was setting up for that when the door slammed open. The sound was enormous in the cold quiet of the chamber. Ethan flinched slightly, not much, just a small pull of the shoulders, and turned to look. A dragon in a guard captain's uniform was standing in the open doorway. He was large even by dragon standards, with dark red scales and a uniform that had more markings on it than the ones Ethan had passed in the corridor. His eyes went first to the Emperor, checking him quickly, then locked onto Ethan with an expression that was not complicated to read. He crossed the chamber in long, fast strides. Ethan stood up. He was not sure why exactly. Standing did not help much given that the guard captain was approximately 3 times his height, but it felt better than being grabbed while crouching. "You," the guard captain said in a voice like something heavy falling downstairs. "Who allowed you in here? This chamber is restricted. You will come with me right now." He reached out one large clawed hand toward Ethan's shoulder, and then stopped. Not because of anything Ethan did. Ethan had not moved. He had not spoken. He had simply stood there holding a calibration instrument in one hand. The guard captain stopped because of a sound from behind them both. A single sound, low and slow and impossible to ignore, like the first deep note of something very large waking up. Both of them turned. Emperor Sorith had raised one claw. Just one, slowly, from where it had rested against the stone platform. He held it up with what looked like considerable effort. His golden eye was open and it was not looking at Ethan anymore. It was looking at the guard captain. The guard captain went completely still. The claw stayed raised for a moment. Then Sorith lowered it back to the stone, slowly, with the careful movement of someone who understood exactly how much each motion cost them. Nobody in the room said anything for several seconds. Then Sorith spoke. His voice was not what Ethan had expected, though he would have struggled to explain what he had expected. It was deep, yes, deeper than anything Ethan had heard come out of a living creature, but it was not loud. It was slow and measured and had a texture to it like old wood, dry and heavy. It had the sound of something that had not been used in a while and was being used carefully. He spoke in Common, which was the shared trade language used across most of the inhabited systems. His Common was perfect and very old-fashioned, the kind that used full words where most people used short ones. He said, "Leave him." That was all. The guard captain opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "You're Imperial?" "Leave him," Sorith said again. Slower this time, with a kind of patience that was somehow more frightening than anger would have been. The guard captain closed his mouth. He stood very straight. He looked at Ethan once more with an expression that communicated a great number of things very clearly without using any words at all. Then he turned, walked back to the door and pulled it shut behind him. The chamber went quiet again. Ethan stood with his calibration instrument and waited. Sorith's golden eye moved back to him. The Emperor looked at him for a long moment with an expression Ethan could not read at all. He had not had enough practice reading dragon faces to know what most expressions meant, and he suspected this one was not common anyway. Then Sorith said, still in that same slow and careful voice, "What are you doing?" It was not quite a question. It had the shape of a question but the weight of something else. Like he was testing whether Ethan would answer honestly or whether he would do what most creatures did in front of him, which was say something careful and political and not entirely true. Ethan held up the calibration instrument slightly. "Fixing your heating unit," he said. "The primary coil is cracked through. That's why the room has been cold. I've got a replacement part in my bag. It'll take me another 20-25 minutes." Soreth looked at him. Ethan looked back. "The cold has been bad for you," Ethan added, because it seemed relevant and because he was not very good at not saying things that seemed relevant. "Whatever else is going on health-wise, the cold won't have helped." Another long silence. Then Emperor Soreth, ruler of the Dragon Empire, 900 years old, said 2 words. "Continue then." Ethan nodded, crouched back down in front of the heating unit and got on with the job. The replacement coil went in cleanly. Ethan had needed to file down one edge of the fitting to make it sit right, which had taken about 8 minutes of careful work with a small metal file from the bottom of his bag. He had done it slowly and without rushing because rushing a coil fitting was how you ended up with a unit that worked for 2 weeks and then failed again, and Ethan did not like coming back to fix the same thing twice. It felt untidy. Once the coil was seated properly, he reconnected the internal wiring, checked each connection twice, replaced the inspection panel, and then ran a basic pressure test through the system to make sure nothing else was cracked or loose further down the line. The pipes behind the wall had some age on them but they held fine. The output valves were stiff but functional. The ignition system on the unit was an older design but it was solid engineering, built to last, the kind of thing that would still be working long after the company that made it had stopped existing. He pressed the ignition switch. The unit made a low sound. A deep, rolling hum that built slowly from nothing, like something large waking up from a long sleep. Then the heat started coming. Not a blast, not a rush, just a slow, steady push of warm air that moved out from the unit and spread across the floor of the chamber the way water spreads when you pour it, finding the low places first and then rising. Ethan stood back and watched the readings on his instrument panel. Temperature climbing. Pressure stable. Output consistent. No irregularities. He nodded once to himself. Behind him, he heard something change in Soreth's breathing. It was subtle. The rhythm was the same, slow, effortful, the breathing of something very old and very tired, but something in the quality of it shifted. Like a sound that had been slightly wrong for a very long time had quietly corrected itself. Ethan did not turn around immediately. He finished writing his completion notes on the work order tablet, checking off each item carefully. Then he started packing his bag. He put each tool back in its place. He put the old cracked primary coil in the waist pocket of his bag to be disposed of properly later. He zipped the main compartment, checked that his thermos was still in the side pocket where he had left it and stood up. The room was already warmer. Not warm yet, it would take an hour or more to fully push the cold out of stone that thick, but the quality of the air had changed. It was no longer the kind of cold that felt permanent. It felt now like a cold that was losing. Ethan picked up his bag and turned around. He was going to leave. That had been the plan. Fix the unit, pack the bag, leave, move on to the next item on the work order list. That was the job. But he looked at Soreth before he left, the way he always looked at a room before leaving it. One final check, making sure everything was as it should be. And it was not. The heating unit was fixed. That part was fine. But the thing in the room that was not fine, the thing that the heating unit had nothing to do with, was Emperor Soreth himself. Now that Ethan was standing and looking properly rather than crouching over his work, he could see the Emperor more clearly than he had before. And what he saw made him think of something specific. He thought of a furnace he had worked on once on a deep space cargo freighter. The furnace had been running, technically. It was on, it was making heat, all the basic indicators said it was functioning. But the output was wrong. The color of the burn was wrong. The sound of it was slightly off in a way that was hard to describe but impossible to ignore once you noticed it. When he had opened it up, he found that someone had been running it on the wrong fuel mixture for so long that the internal components had started to degrade in ways that were not immediately visible from the outside. The furnace looked like a furnace. It just wasn't working like one anymore. Soreth looked like an emperor. He had the size, the scales, the presence, even lying still, even barely breathing. There was something in the room that told you this creature was important in a way that went beyond titles and uniforms. But the scales were dull where they should have been bright. The chest moved too shallowly. The golden eyes, even open, had a quality to them like a light that was present but distant. Ethan stood there for a moment with his bag over his shoulder. Then he said, "You don't look right." He said it the same way he would have said it about the furnace. Straightforward. Observational. Not unkind, just direct. Like a furnace running on the wrong fuel. Everything's still going, but something underneath isn't working the way it's supposed to. He had not entirely planned to say it. It had come out the way things came out when he was not filtering himself, which happened more often than was probably professional. There was a silence. A long one. Ethan waited to see what would happen. He was aware that he had just told a 900-year-old dragon emperor that he looked wrong, which was possibly not the most politically careful thing he had ever done. The guard captain was probably still somewhere nearby. There were many ways this could go. Then Soreth laughed. It was not a small laugh. It was not a polite sound or a short sound. It came up from somewhere deep inside the enormous chest and it rolled out into the chamber like the first crack of thunder before a storm, deep and real and completely uncontrolled. It shook the air. It shook the walls. Ethan felt it in his chest the way you feel bass through a floor. Dust moved in the corners of the ceiling far above. Ethan stood very still and waited for it to finish. Outside the chamber, through the heavy iron door, he heard voices, sharp, urgent, confused. The guards reacting to a sound they had clearly not heard in a very long time and did not know what to do with. The laugh faded slowly, the way thunder fades, rolling away into a low rumble and then into silence. Soreth's chest settled. His breathing, for just a moment, sounded easier than it had since Ethan arrived. The golden eyes looked at Ethan with something new in them. Not just observation. Something more engaged than that. A furnace on the wrong fuel, Soreth repeated. His voice was still slow and dry, but there was something different in it now. Something that had not been there before. That is the most honest thing anyone has said to me in a very long time. Ethan was not sure what to say to that, so he said nothing. They tell me I am resting, Soreth continued. They tell me I am recovering. They tell me the healers are working and that I must be patient. He paused. They have been saying this for 2 years. Ethan looked at him. Are you getting better? No, Soreth said simply. Are you getting worse? Pause. Yes. Ethan set his bag down on the floor. Not because he had decided to stay, he had not consciously decided anything. It was just that standing with a bag over your shoulder was a position that meant you were about to leave, and something told him that leaving right now was the wrong thing to do. He sat down on the floor. Cross-legged, back straight, the way he sat when he was thinking through a difficult problem. What do the healers say is causing it? He asked. Soreth looked at him for a moment with an expression that might have been surprise. My inner fire is fading. It is the source of dragon life. When it goes, everything goes with it. The healers have tried many things. Nothing has worked. How long have you been in this room? Many months. With the heating broken. Soreth said nothing. But something moved in his expression. Okay, Ethan said mostly to himself. He was not a doctor. He was not a healer. He did not know anything about dragon biology beyond the basic environmental requirements that were covered in the standard contractor briefing, which he had read on the shuttle coming in because he always read the briefing materials. But he was very good at listening to systems. At hearing what was wrong underneath the surface. At asking the basic questions first before assuming the problem was complicated. He looked up at the Emperor. Can you tell me what it felt like, Ethan said, when it first started getting worse? And Soreth, who had not truly spoken to anyone in months, who had been surrounded by healers and guards and court officials all speaking carefully and formally and saying nothing real, opened his mouth. And began to talk. Ethan sat on the cold stone floor for a long time and listened. Soreth talked slowly at first. Carefully. Like someone who had forgotten how to do it and was remembering one word at a time. He talked about the feeling in his chest, not pain exactly, more like a warmth that had once been constant and reliable and was now unpredictable, like a fire that mostly stayed lit but sometimes, without warning, dropped very low. He talked about how it had started small. A tiredness that did not go away with rest. A heaviness in his limbs that had not been there before. A coldness that came from inside rather than outside. Ethan listened and did not interrupt. He asked a question occasionally. Small ones. Practical ones. When did that start? Was it gradual or sudden? Did anything make it better? Did anything make it worse? He asked them the same way he asked questions when diagnosing a system fault, not to show how much he knew, but because he genuinely needed the information to understand what he was looking at. Soreth answered each one. At some point Ethan noticed that the Emperor's voice had changed. It had started dry and slow and distant, the voice of someone performing the act of speaking rather than actually doing it. But somewhere in the middle of talking it had shifted into something more present. More connected. The words came a little easier. The pauses were shorter. Nobody had asked Soreth these questions before. Not like this. The healers asked clinical questions and wrote down the answers and discussed them amongst themselves in formal language. The court officials did not ask questions at all. They gave updates and received instructions and bowed and left. His family, what remained of it, visited rarely and spoke carefully and left looking frightened. Ethan asked questions like he was trying to fix something, which, in his mind, he was. After a while, Ethan said he wanted to look at the medical records. He said it simply without making it a big request. He said he probably would not understand most of it, but he liked to see the full picture when he was trying to work something out. Soreth looked at him for a moment. Then he called for a guard. The guard who came in was not the guard captain. He was younger, with lighter-colored scales, and he looked at Ethan with open confusion but did what the Emperor asked without argument. He brought a data tablet with the Imperial medical record loaded on it and handed it to Ethan with the expression of someone handing something valuable to someone they were not sure should have it. Ethan thanked him. The guard blinked, then left. Ethan sat with the tablet in his lap and went through the records. He had been right that he would not understand most of it. The medical terminology was in Imperial Dragon script with common translations underneath, but the common translations used medical words that were specific to dragon physiology and Ethan did not know most of them. The charts and biological readings meant very little to him without context. The healer notes were long and detailed and full of references to treatments and procedures that he had no knowledge of. But Ethan was patient and he was methodical, and he had a specific habit when looking at any record of a system that had been failing. He always looked at the timeline first. He went through the records in order of date, oldest to newest, ignoring the parts he did not understand and focusing on the parts he did. Basic things. Dates. Measurements. The notes that described observable changes rather than clinical interpretations. He read for a long time. And then he stopped. He went back 3 pages and read something again. Then he looked up at the chamber around him, at the frost still visible in the corners of the walls, at the fire brackets that had been running low for months. Then he looked back at the tablet. He read the entry one more time to make sure he was reading it correctly. The heating unit fault had been logged 8 months ago. That was when the problem had first been recorded in the station maintenance system. 8 months ago. He scrolled back further in the medical records. The entries describing the significant worsening of Soratha's condition, the sharp drop in his internal temperature readings, the rapid decrease in his energy and responsiveness, the acceleration of the decline that had the healers most concerned. Those entries started 7.5 months ago. 2 weeks after the heating failed. Ethan sat with that for a moment. He thought about what he knew about dragon biology from the contractor briefing. It had been a short section, basic information, the kind of thing included so that human contractors knew not to do anything that would accidentally harm a dragon client. Dragons were warm-blooded in a way that went deeper than most species. Their internal flame, the biological process at the center of their physiology, required a consistent external temperature to function properly. Not just comfortable temperature. Deep, sustained heat. The kind that soaked into the body over time. Without it, the internal processes that kept a dragon healthy began to slow down. The body redirected energy. Things that should be maintained started to be neglected as the system focused on the most basic functions. In a young, healthy dragon this was manageable. The body compensated. In a very old dragon, already weakened, already dealing with a failing internal flame. Ethan looked at the dates again. The cold had not caused the illness. He was clear on that. Sorath had been declining before the heating failed. The inner flame fading was a real condition, a serious one, and the cold had not invented it. But 8 months of sustained cold, in a body that was already struggling, in a room where the temperature had been dropping since the coil cracked. It was like finding a person who was already ill and then discovering someone had also been quietly turning down the heat in their room for 8 months and nobody had connected the two things. Ethan closed the tablet and stood up. Sorath watched him. "You found something?" the Emperor said. It was not a question. "Maybe," Ethan said. "I need to talk to your head healer first. I might be wrong about this. I'm not a doctor." "You are not," Sorath agreed. "But continue." Ethan picked up his bag, nodded once at the Emperor, and left the chamber. The head Imperial healer's name was Draven. He was old, not as old as Sorath, nobody was as old as Sorath, but old in the way that suggested centuries of experience and the confidence that came with it. His scales were a pale, almost silver gray. He wore formal healer robes with Imperial markings and he held himself in a way that communicated very clearly that he was an important person who was very busy and whatever you needed could probably wait. He looked at Ethan the way most people looked at Ethan on this station, like something that had arrived in the wrong place and would shortly be redirected. Ethan held up the data tablet. "I've been looking at the Emperor's medical records," he said. Draven's expression shifted. "Those records are..." "The Emperor gave me access," Ethan said. "I'd like to show you something." Draven looked at the tablet. Then at Ethan. He did not move. Ethan waited. He was good at waiting. He had spent a significant portion of his working life waiting, for parts to arrive, for systems to cycle through, for people to finish saying the things they needed to say before they were ready to listen. Draven made a short sound that was not quite agreement but was close enough, and looked at the tablet. Ethan opened the records to the timeline he had been looking at. He pointed to the date the heating fault was logged. Then he moved his finger across to the medical entries from 2 weeks later. He did not say anything. He just showed Draven the 2 dates side by side and let the healer look at them. Draven looked. His eyes moved between the 2 entries. His expression did not change immediately. It stayed in the polite, slightly impatient arrangement it had been in since Ethan walked in. Then it changed. Slowly. The way ice changes when warmth reaches it, not all at once but in a way that once it starts you can see it happening. The impatience left first. Then the politeness. What was underneath was something more complicated. His eyes moved through the records, going back further, cross-referencing things, and with each page the expression became quieter and more still. He was silent for a long time. The sustained cold, Ethan said quietly, in a body already struggling to maintain its inner flame. 8 months of it. Draven did not answer immediately. It won't cure him, Ethan said. I know that. I'm not saying that. But the room is warm again now. I fixed the unit this morning. And if the cold was accelerating things. It was, Draven said. His voice was flat and quiet. The voice of someone making themselves say something difficult. These numbers, the rate of decline over this period, we attributed it to the natural progression. We did not. He stopped. He looked at the dates one more time. We did not check the environmental logs, he said. Very quietly. We did not think to. Ethan said nothing. There was nothing useful to say. Draven stood straight and looked at Ethan with an expression that was hard to read, complicated, and somewhere underneath it, something that might have been gratitude mixed with something less comfortable. The warmth, Draven said carefully. If maintained consistently from this point, it will not reverse what has happened. But it may slow what comes next. It may give him time. He paused. Real time, he added. Like he wanted to be honest about what that meant. Ethan nodded. He picked up his bag. Good, he said simply, and walked back toward the Emperor's chamber. The station had a rhythm to it that Ethan had learned without trying. The lights in the corridors shifted from bright to dim at the same time each evening, mimicking the cycle of a day even though there was no sun outside and no real reason to mark the difference between day and night on a space station except that living things needed that rhythm to feel normal. The sounds of the station changed too, the busier noise of daytime work fading into something quieter and more settled as the evening cycle began. Fewer footsteps. Fewer voices. The deep background hum of the station's systems becoming more noticeable when everything else quieted down. Ethan had been on the station for 3 days when the first evening request came. He was in the lower deck maintenance corridor finishing the ventilation unit on his work order list when the young guard with the lighter scales found him. The guard looked slightly uncertain, like he had been given a message he was not entirely sure how to deliver. He told Ethan that the Emperor was asking for him. Ethan put his tools down, wiped his hands on a cloth from his pocket, picked up his bag and followed the guard. He was not sure what he expected when he arrived. Some kind of formal arrangement perhaps. Court officials present. Some protocol he would need to be guided through. But when the chamber door opened it was quiet inside and warm, genuinely warm now, the heat steady and even the frost gone from the walls completely. The fire brackets had been properly refueled and burned clean and bright. The stone itself seemed to hold the warmth differently, like it had finally accepted that the cold was not coming back. Soreth was more alert than he had been the previous days. His head was raised slightly from the platform. His golden eyes were clearer. There were no officials. No guards inside the room. Just the Emperor and the empty space and the warmth and the sound of the heating unit doing its job steadily in the background. Soreth looked at Ethan and said, "Tell me something." Ethan sat down on the floor in his usual spot, cross-legged, bag beside him. "What kind of something?" "Anything," Soreth said. "Something from your world. Something ordinary." Ethan thought about that for a moment. Then he told Soreth about rain. He described it simply and honestly, what it looked like, what it sounded like on a roof when you were inside and warm, what it felt like if you were outside and not prepared for it. He described the smell of it, which was one of those things that was very hard to put into words but which almost every human knew immediately and completely. He talked about how rain in the city was different from rain in the countryside, how in the city it bounced off stone and metal and ran in fast rivers along the gutters, and how in the countryside it fell more softly and disappeared into the ground and made everything smell green. Soreth listened to every word. He did not interrupt. He did not ask questions while Ethan was talking. He just listened with the full attention of someone receiving something they had not known they needed. His breathing was slow and even. His eyes stayed on Ethan the whole time. When Ethan finished, Soreth was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "We have no rain here. We have never had rain. On my home world the water came up from the ground, not down from the sky. I have read about rain. I did not understand it from reading." "It's one of those things that's hard to explain," Ethan agreed. "Yes," Soreth said. "But you explained it well." That was the first evening. After that it became a pattern without either of them deciding it was a pattern. Each evening when the corridor lights shifted to dim, the young guard would find Ethan wherever he was working and bring him to the chamber. Ethan would sit on the floor. Soreth would ask him to tell him something. And Ethan would talk. He told Soreth about food. Not grand meals, simple things. The specific satisfaction of a good sandwich when you were genuinely hungry. The way coffee smelled in the morning before it cooled down. His mother's cooking, which was not complicated but was always exactly right, the kind of cooking where everything tasted like it had been made with full attention. He told Soreth about his mother's garden. She had kept it on the small strip of ground behind their house on Earth since before Ethan was born. It was not a large garden, you could walk across it in about 15 steps, but she treated it with the seriousness of someone managing something important. She grew tomatoes and herbs and flowers whose names Ethan could never remember correctly, and she knew every plant in it individually the way some people knew their friends. She talked to them sometimes. Ethan had asked her once when he was young if that actually helped, and she had said she did not know, but it did not hurt and the garden seemed happy enough. Soreth was very still when Ethan described the garden. Then he said quietly, "She sounds like someone who pays attention to living things." "She is," Ethan said. "That is rarer than it should be," Soreth said. As the evenings continued, something shifted. It went from Soreth asking and Ethan answering, to something more like a real conversation. Soreth began to offer things back. Not immediately and not all at once, but gradually, the way a door opens that has been closed for a long time. It moves slowly at first, stiff on its hinges, and then more easily as it remembers how. He told Ethan about his home world. Not the history of it, not the political history that filled the imperial records, but the physical place. The way it smelled in the early morning. The color of the sky at certain times of year. A river he had spent time near when he was young, long before he was emperor, long before most of the people currently alive had been born. He talked about his mate. Her name was Sareth and she had been gone for 300 years, and he talked about her the way you talk about someone when you have carried them quietly inside you for so long that the grief has become something else. Not gone, just changed into something you live alongside rather than something that stops you. Ethan listened to all of it. He did not try to say the right thing after each piece. He did not offer comfort in the formal way with careful words designed to make the other person feel better. He just listened genuinely, with full attention, the way he had listened to Soreth in the beginning when he was trying to understand what was wrong. It was the same quality of listening. It just was not about a machine anymore. Soreth noticed. Ethan could tell from the way the Emperor talked. More freely each evening, less carefully, the way you talk when you trust that the person across from you is actually taking it in. One evening Ethan arrived to find Soreth looking out through the narrow window set high in the chamber wall. It showed a small piece of the space outside, dark, distant stars, the edge of a nearby planet pale and still. Soreth looked at it without speaking for a while after Ethan sat down. Then he said, "I am not afraid of it. I want you to know that. I have lived long enough to not be afraid." Ethan did not pretend not to know what he meant. "Okay," he said. "But I find," Soreth continued slowly, "that there is a difference between not being afraid and being ready. I thought for a long time that they were the same thing. They are not." Ethan sat with that. Then he said, "What does ready feel like?" Soreth turned from the window and looked at him. "I am not entirely sure yet," he said honestly. "But I think it has something to do with being known. Truly known. Not as an emperor. Not as a title or a symbol or a thing people are afraid of." He paused. "Just as what I am." The chamber was very quiet. Ethan did not say anything. There was nothing to add to that and he knew it. It was later that same evening, when they had been sitting in comfortable silence for a while, that Soreth moved. Slowly, with great deliberateness, the way he did everything now, measuring the cost of each motion and deciding it was worth it. He shifted his great scaled hand across the stone platform until it reached the edge, and then lowered it to the floor beside where Ethan sat, and placed it gently over Ethan's. The hand was enormous. Warm now, genuinely warm, the warmth that came from inside rather than just from the room. It covered Ethan's completely. The scales were smooth and dry and very old. Ethan did not move. He did not pull away. He sat still and let the weight of it rest there. Soreth said one word. Low and slow and in the old dragon language. Saketh. Ethan waited. It is the oldest word we have for it, Soreth said quietly. There is no common translation that is fully correct. But the closest is this. He paused. One who witnessed me truly. The heating unit hummed steadily in the background. Ethan looked at the enormous hand resting over his and said nothing for a long time. Then he said simply, I'm glad I came to fix the heater. Soreth made a low sound that was not quite a laugh but was close to one. Warmer than a laugh. Quieter. So am I, the Emperor said. So am I. Soreth passed on a quiet evening. The corridor lights had just shifted to dim. The station had settled into its night rhythm, that familiar low hum, the reduced footsteps, the particular stillness that came each evening like something the station had decided to do out of habit. The heating unit in Chamber 7 was running steadily, warm and even, doing exactly what it was supposed to do. Ethan was in the chamber when it happened. He had been there most of that day. Not because anyone had asked him to stay. His work order list had been completed 4 days ago. Every item checked off, every fault fixed, every system tested and signed off. Technically his contract was finished. Technically he could have taken the next transport shuttle back and been home within the week. He had not booked a shuttle. He sat in his usual spot on the floor and he was telling Soreth about the first job he had ever done alone. He was 19, fresh out of technical training, and he had been sent to fix a heating fault on a small agricultural station 2 hours from Earth. The fault had turned out to be much more complicated than the work order described. He had been there for 4 days instead of 1, sleeping on a cot in the maintenance room, eating food from the station canteen, working through the problem piece by piece until he found it buried deep in a secondary pressure system that the original installation team had wired incorrectly 15 years earlier. He had been very proud when he fixed it. Soreth had been listening with his eyes half open, the way he listened in the later evenings when he was tired but still present. Still there. His breathing had been slower than usual that day but not alarmingly so, or at least Ethan had told himself that. He was aware that he was not a healer and that his ability to judge these things was limited. He kept talking because Soreth liked to listen and because the talking felt like the right thing to do. At some point the breathing changed. It did not become distressed. It did not become loud or difficult. It simply became very slow. And then slower. And then it became the kind of stillness that was different from sleep. A deeper stillness, a final one, the kind that once it arrives does not leave. The golden eyes closed completely. The chamber stayed warm. Ethan sat on the floor for a long time without moving. He did not call for anyone immediately. He just sat in the quiet room with the sound of the heating unit running in the background and the warmth that he had put back into this room pressing gently against the old stone walls. He thought about furnaces running on the wrong fuel. He thought about rain. He thought about a garden on Earth with 15 steps across it and tomatoes and flowers whose names he could never remember. He thought about a word in the old dragon language that had no perfect translation in common. After a while he stood up, picked up his bag and went to find the guard captain. The station changed overnight. That was the only way to describe it. By the next morning the corridors that had been quiet and half empty were full of movement. Officials arriving from other parts of the empire, ships docking in numbers that filled every bay, dragons in formal court dress moving through the hallways with the urgent controlled energy of people who had been preparing for something and now had to do it. Ethan stayed out of the way. He went back to his small contractor quarters in the lower deck and sat on the edge of his bed and drank cold coffee from his thermos and did not know what to do with himself. He thought about booking a shuttle. He got as far as looking up the departure schedule before he stopped and put the tablet down. On the second day after Soreth's passing, the young guard with the lighter scales came to find him. The guard's expression was more formal than usual but underneath it was something that looked like it might have been genuine feeling, which Ethan appreciated. The guard told him that he was requested to attend the Imperial Decree reading in 3 days. He said it was not optional, but he said it gently, in a way that made it clear he understood that Ethan might find this difficult to understand and was trying to be helpful. Ethan asked what an Imperial Decree reading was. The guard explained. When an emperor passed, their final decrees, decisions made in the last period of their reign, sealed and witnessed, were read before the full imperial court. It was one of the oldest ceremonies in the Dragon Empire. Every decree was binding. Every word carried the full weight of 900 years of imperial authority. Ethan asked why he was being asked to attend. The guard said he was not able to answer that. Ethan looked at him for a moment. Then he said okay and asked what he should wear. The guard looked at Ethan's faded company jacket. He looked at it for long enough that the answer was fairly clear without being spoken. Ethan looked down at the jacket himself. War Ermolutions. He smoothed the front of it with one hand. I'll see what I can find, Ethan said. He could not find anything significantly better. He had not packed for formal occasions. He was a heating technician on a contractor job, not a diplomat. He had one cleaner version of his work clothes, darker, less worn, no peeling letters on the back, and he wore those. He cleaned his boots. He combed his hair, which promptly went back to sitting flat on one side and not the other. He looked at himself in the small mirror in his quarters. He looked exactly like what he was. He decided that was probably fine. The Imperial Court chamber was the largest room Ethan had ever stood in. It made Chamber 7 look small. The ceiling was so high it disappeared into shadow. The floor was dark polished stone that reflected the light of hundreds of fire brackets burning along the walls. The space was filled with dragons, rows and rows of them in formal court dress, scales polished, completely silent. Thousands of them. The air had a weight to it, a collective stillness that felt ancient and deliberate. Ethan walked in with the young guard beside him and tried not to think too carefully about how many eyes turned to look at him. He was placed near the front, to one side, which meant that most of the court was behind him and he could not see their expressions, which he decided was probably better. At the front of the chamber stood Prince Aldrich, no longer prince, now emperor, though his formal coronation was still days away. He was young by dragon standards, his scales a deep clear green, his bearing careful and serious in the way of someone who had prepared for this moment for a long time but still felt the full weight of it now that it had arrived. He had been in the doorway that one evening. He had watched. Ethan remembered him but did not know if Aldrich remembered Ethan. A senior court official read the decrees. There were several matters of governance, of succession, of territorial arrangements, of things Ethan did not fully understand and which were clearly not his business. He stood quietly and waited and tried to look appropriate. Then the official paused. He looked down at the final item on the document in his hands with an expression that was very controlled but contained something underneath it. Something like the expression Draven the healer had worn when he looked at the dates in the medical record. The expression of someone encountering something they had not expected. The official read the final decree. He read the name Ethan Ward. He read the title Saketh. He read the full meaning of it, Sacred Witness, one who saw the Emperor truly, and he read that this title was granted with the full authority of the Imperial Seal and was binding and permanent and recorded in the Imperial Archive where it would remain as long as the archive stood. The chamber was absolutely silent. Ethan stood very still. He was aware of the silence behind him in a physical way, like something pressing gently against his back. Thousands of dragons who had served this empire for decades and centuries, hearing a human technician's name read from an imperial decree as the holder of an honor that had existed for 900 years and had never once been given to anyone outside the dragon bloodline. Then Emperor Aldrich moved. He stepped forward from his position at the front of the chamber. He was tall and his formal robes moved with him in a way that made the motion look very deliberate. He stopped when he was a few feet from Ethan. He looked at Ethan directly, the same golden eyes as his grandfather. Ethan noticed the same depth in them. And he bowed. It was a full bow. Head lowered, slow, held for a moment before he straightened. Behind Ethan the sound of movement was like a slow wave, the rustle and shift of thousands of dragons following their emperor's lead. He could not see it but he felt it. The air in the room changed. Ethan stood in his clean work clothes in front of a bowing imperial court and felt something move through him that was large and quiet and did not have a simple name. He bowed back. Felt like the right thing to do. When Aldrich straightened he looked at Ethan with an expression that was formal and young and genuine all at the same time. He said, "My grandfather spoke of you." In his final recorded words before the decree he said, "The human sees things as they are. That is the rarest gift." Ethan did not know what to say to that. He said, he was easy to talk to. Once he got started. Something moved across Aldrich's face. Not quite a smile, something more complicated than that. Something that looked like grief and warmth arriving at the same moment, which was what they often did. Ethan looked around the chamber for a moment. Then he said quietly, "Is there anything else on the station that needs looking at? While I'm here." The silence held for 1 second. Then the laughter came. It moved through the court the way warmth moves through cold stone, gradually from the front, spreading back through the rows until it filled the enormous room completely. Real laughter, unguarded, the kind that arrives when something is both funny and true at the same time. Aldrich laughed too. It sounded younger than his face looked. An hour later Ethan walked back through the corridor toward the lower decks. His tool bag was over his shoulder. His boots made the same quiet sound on the stone floor they always made. The corridor lights were bright, daytime cycle. The station hummed around him the way it always did. He passed Chamber 7 on the way. The door was closed. The corridor outside it was warm. He stopped for just a moment and put one hand flat against the stone wall beside the door. The warmth came through clearly. The unit was still running, doing its job. He took his hand away and kept walking. At the end of the corridor he stopped and set his bag down and crouched beside it. From the front pocket he took out a small metal piece, a flame seal Imperial issue, given to him by the young guard that morning without explanation, as if it were simply something that needed to happen. He turned it over in his hands once. It was small and solid and very well made. He took his welding tool from the bag. It took him 4 minutes to attach the seal to the side of the toolbox properly. He was careful about it. He made sure it was straight and solid and would not come loose with regular use. When he was done he ran his thumb across it once, feeling the clean edges of it. Then he stood up, picked up the bag and walked toward the next job.